Wanted to give a little bit of a mention to Norm Macdonald, who died recently, and just in a bizarre fashion. He had cancer, and his family or friends, nobody knew about it for years. So he'd been living with cancer, doing shows and gigs, and it just who knows why exactly. People have speculated on it. I'm not interested in speculating on it right now, but it sort of fits his style of living and comedy and just his bizarre nature.
Would you say he was kind of isolated?
Yeah, and that seems like it's possibly his own doing in some ways. Although I don't know, he sort of talked about himself as though he were isolated. And I want to get to that because I'm not as interested in his comedy. I mean, I am. I think he was a genius comedian, and I think that sometimes people didn't realize what high-level comedy he was doing, even though he kind of played the idiot all the time. I'm interested in an interview I heard him do with Marc Maron. And by the way, I've got to give Marc Maron credit. I think people think that Marc Maron is this idiot that tells jokes and just knows famous people, so he has an interesting podcast. But man, he was doing some good motivational interviewing with Norm Macdonald. And so anyway, Norm Macdonald had a gambling issue, and he never called it an addiction, and he always talked about it in total common sense terms. But I don't know for sure if it was ever resolved. If so, then I can guess how he did resolve it and sort of managed his life from there on. He lost money. He lost all of his money 3 times. And he mentioned that feeling being sort of relieving in a way, which I can relate to. I remember there being times when I had, what is it that you say, a heroin monkey on my back, that I kind of burned all my money, was not feeling well, kind of in bed, thinking, oh man, I can't really have no way to access this thing again. And it was weirdly relieving. Like I felt like crap, but on the other hand, I didn't have to think about anything. And that's kind of an awful notion about how you live your life, where it feels relieving that you don't have to think about anything. That gets you close to like nihilistic.
But you were like in your 20s, and he was, by the time he interviewed Maron, he's, I don't know, in his 50s.
Probably something like that. And they were talking about the past. So he mentioned he doesn't have that issue anymore. So Maron was curious. He wanted to know, well, how does this happen to a person, you know? And so he started out by asking, well, what's the thing about gambling for you? And Norm said, I've tried out all different stuff. I drank in the past, and I had done drugs in the past. I just wasn't really interested in them so much. But gambling was kind of a way that I could, first of all, there was the chance that you could win something. And he'd gone out and kind of casually bet money before, and one night he was in a casino in Atlantic City and won $100,000. I mean, he just kept going and going and won. So he not only had the idea that it's possible for him to win a lot of money, but he knew that it was that it's happened to him before. And so Maron was kind of saying, you didn't really need the money though, did you? And he's saying, no, I guess not. So more, it was just I bet on sports a lot. And so I'd watch a sports game. I knew the rules, knew what was going on. There was some excitement involved in, watching the certain players that I picked, whether they did well or not, whether a team's beating the spread. And there was a non-ambivalence about that in a way that I didn't really feel I had in other areas of my life. Now, this is starting to sound like an LPP session, somebody who signs up for our program and wants to talk about this stuff. So Maron sort of relates.
That description makes it sound like he was in control because he knew the parameters of the sports teams.
He felt, well, for now, because Maron was asking what was attractive about gambling. What was the attractive part about it? So he was talking about the actual involvement in gambling. When he's feeling at his best, he's putting in some kind of money. He's in a zone. He feels it's something that he recognizes that is pretty much constant. He knows the kind of feelings. He knows that he's got a sense of control, and he doesn't have to think about other stuff in his life. So Maron related to him on some fronts and said, well, what's going on in life that, you want to zone in like that? And so Norm was saying, well, I just kind of think about how it just seems mundane to me. Of course, I have comedy And that's sort of the way I get around. He goes through interactions and sees them in a meta kind of a lens. He sees them as more than they are. He's very interested in how people can totally be totally mindless when he's actually seen that happen in front of him. And so Maron was saying, what else? And he said, well, I think about death a lot. And so now I feel like there's this thing that's life that I'm not quite getting. And then I'm terrified of death. So I just don't want to deal with it. So Maron moved him forward and said, so, you gambled, you lost all your money. It's like, that's not, didn't seem like you wanted to be losing it. He said, no, there was nothing like going totally broke to realize that that's not where I wanted to be. There's something freeing about being totally broke for a minute, because it was like one of those times that I knew what I had. There were only a certain number of moves I had in life now, and so I could really focus. But also, then you had to build yourself back up, and I did it with comedy, and it was just a terrifying process that I repeated. So I went back. He says I went back to gambling because I didn't really have another alternative. So they got to talking and saying, "Well, how'd you move on from that?" And he said, "I don't know. I don't know if I've really moved on yet, but first I got thinking about." I have comedy, of course, so that was something that helped pull me out of that sort of way of thinking. So I always sort of had that in my back pocket. It was something, it was purposeful, yeah. But it didn't do everything for him, so he had to spread his wings a little bit and find even more purpose in other kind of ways. And so at first he said, I want to get into religion, because that kind of tackles the whole death thing and the life thing. And so he said, I did a lot of reading and got really into it. But then he's I can see through bullshit so easily that sometimes religion has parts of it that I find bullshitty. And so I just couldn't quite grasp onto it. Marc Maron.
Get into the philosophy thing. I mean, the two areas I always look at are work and professional purpose. I think I looked him up, and he had two kind of marriages that were relatively short-lived. Are you tuned into his personal life at all?
Yeah, I think he had failed marriages, and there's another. This is going to be a diversion for what I'm going for here, but he also had an interesting idea about sex. He's not the first person I've heard talk about sex like this, but he had no drive or interest in being sexual with someone. He thought of it as, he would make jokes about it. But then when pressed, he said, I kind of really believe this. Sex is just weird. He said, I feel like it's, there's something, how did he put it? Something not noble. That's not what he said about it. And it makes me feel weird. And I don't really like it. So he had, weird.
How do you go back to somebody who avoids any kind of sexual intimacy? How does that grab you as a coach?
I want to know more. I'm interested in why. Because I think that sexual intimacy generally is a pretty foundational pillar of a life. And
it's both to the Life Process program and recovery. Intimacy's essential pillar.
I would have reservations about just keeping that point totally dormant and not exploring it. You know what I mean? I wouldn't say, okay, so no sex, and then move on to something else. I might ask him, are you interested in exploring that? What's that? Did
he have children?
Let me get there, because I'm kind of moving it in a progression, and you're asking the right questions about it. So Maron asked him, because he noticed Norm was talking a lot about, all right, how'd you get over gambling? And he was saying, well, I kind of looked inward. And I tried to think about how to build myself up and what I wanted out of life. And I read a lot, and I tried to be part of a religion. And so Maron does this sort of, gets him to be a head taller than himself in that conversation, gets Norm to be a head taller than himself in the conversation by inviting, Norm, of course, that's important. And then, of course, something about being involved in something bigger than yourself or more than just yourself is important too. And Norm agreed. Yeah, that's true. And then he started thinking, well, I thought about helping the blind. it's always like a left field, but I thought about helping people who are blind for a while, because I thought about that, how they must see the world, and they could probably help me in some ways with their perspective, and I could probably help them in some ways. And I'm interested in helping people who feel like they're maybe lost or can't access things. So they got to talking about that, and Maron was just trying to say to him, I guess there's two things that you're trying to do. One is to get a good sense of yourself, and the other is connect with the world. He didn't say it in those terms, but he basically was saying that, and in a really lighthearted, non-judgmental way. At the end of all of it, Norm agreed that what he's working on now and what he's basically doing successfully is not just not gambling anymore, or not just not having a good life. It's more like, how do I attack life or be optimistic about it and proactive about it in a way that I'm involved in it and for myself, so I understand myself, and also with people and things around me. He didn't say it in this interview, but he talks a lot about, in the later years of his life, talks a lot about how meaningful it has been to spend time with his son, to watch him growing up, to go on trips with him. So you mentioned that. And as I'm putting all this together, I think
52, and I think he had cancer for like 8 or 10 years.
Yeah.
So
bizarre.
a lot of this soul searching might have been involved in his being very close to death.
It could be. It could be. But it seems like, well, I don't know. I have a sense that he got past his worst moments in life and was sort of on a path to greater moments in life. And as I was listening to this, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I thought, how would I deal with this? Sort of, I would deal with it the way Marc Maron does, except he's not a therapist or a clinician or a coach. He just wants to bring value to his audience and make the conversation interesting. But I would deal with it in a similar way, maybe exploring some of those aspects of life and trying to get him to expand on what's interesting to him. And I want to throw it back to you. How might you discuss things with him? How might you take what he already gave you, assuming he gave you the information I did, and build on that?
Well, you follow the guideposts that he sets up. He wants to be valued, add value to life. He has a son. He wants to connect to the world. I guess just being as prosaic as possible, I would say, when you lost all your money, did that affect your whatever your legal obligations were to your son?
That's spot on what I was hoping the next questions would be. So I would read about that and look up anything about him talking about it. I never did hear that connection. Maybe it's something I didn't want to talk about, but that's exactly what I was thinking. As someone coaching him, I would want to know about that. When those things happened, and you said you wish they didn't happen, tell me about some of the things you wish didn't happen, and how they had an impact on your life. Others.
I was thinking of maybe diverging a little bit. How do you see values in your own addictive life? How would you describe the role of values and money in your own addictive? Well, you just talked about money. In a way, you were kind of relieved when you were tapped out, but you were in your 20s then.
Mm. Oh, you were actually putting that to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the absence of values is just sort of chaos. And you kind of have that. I'll speak for me. I kind of have values, but there seems like different values all competing for my attention. It was hard for me to pin down which of those values were the lasting ones, and that it was important to keep those lasting ones in good shape, and then build on them.
I know one of the things you told me was that you were disappointed with yourself through some financial shenanigans you pulled when you were that period.
Yeah.
And I know, I believe I know you're extremely scrupulous with money now. Of course, now you have a daughter. She doesn't go to college, but expenses come up. So, but would you say your values cleared up before you got a daughter? Is that sort of the pathway you took? rather than, oh, you got a daughter, and then you said, what the hell am I doing? I think
Yeah, yeah. We're on the same wavelength. It's sort of like it's not like sometimes it's nice to be reminded of your values, and you hope that the way that you're reminded isn't that you totally oppose your most sacred ones. And like you don't want to realize that a value is your most sacred value because you screwed it up. But on the other hand, since I did screw some of those up, they were brought into focus, and those things were important to me. And I think that's what you're saying, right, about Norm, is that you don't really need to ask somebody what you could guess. If he has a son who he loves, if he has family, if he's connected to any other human beings, that's one thing you could shoot for. So, you have a son. How do you feel about your son? You lost all your money. How did you feel about losing all your money? How did that losing all your money affect your relationship with your son? And talk about that a little bit.
If you lose all your money permanently, then you won't be able to send him to college, for example.
Right. Right.
Well, I mean, he's probably got ongoing payments and all. We talked a little bit about you and money, and I believe I know you to be very scrupulous. For example, you and I sometimes owe somebody money for some editorial work, and I know you just like say, oh, how long, when do we pay? You're very, you don't want to rip anybody off. I've never bought a lottery ticket in my life. How about yourself?
I think I have, and it was more like a gag. So no, I haven't bought a lottery ticket hoping I was going to win the lottery. That's for sure.
By the way, we have a set of values in our book, over outgrowing addiction, and some of the values are money's a value. Money's a really critical thing in life, and it ties into the values of responsibility and communication and intimacy and achievement. I wouldn't want to win the lottery. It's not only that I don't buy a lottery ticket because I think it's stupid. I don't want to win the lottery because I just want to sort of earn my way in life, And, I've had a few challenges in my time. But it might be going overboard to say I welcome them. I always thought, well, you described that with Norm when he got down to zero. He said, well, I better get my act together. What is it I do? And I guess the answer was, well, I have ways of making money. I'm a pretty famous comedian. By the way, I had the impression that he had sort of been embargoed. I had the impression he had sort of burned a lot of bridges. Is that he had he hadn't run out of room to make money? That's not true.
No, he could always make money. So he got kicked off SNL, and yeah, it was more or less for jokes about O.J. Simpson that he was making, and that was the big one.
His first movie, in general, was panned critically. I sort of was interested in Norm Macdonald. I like people to get kicked off things for doing things that are offbeat. But I didn't think he made much use of it. He went out and made a movie that got everybody sort of interested in it. And there were some talented people involved in it, Artie Lang and other people.
Yeah.
And it didn't make money. And people, it was kind of low taste kind of movie.
Yeah.
It was about getting paid to do revengeance things. And so I guess the thing I'm thinking, he wants to do meaningful things and explore life and death. I guess I would say, do you feel that any of your comedy has really been a positive effect on life? Do you feel that your comedy has a chance to be really meaningful and have a positive effect on people? Do you think is that what he was saying to Marc Maron, that he did believe that he had a positive effect with his comedy.
Here's the thing. So one of the reasons I wanted to go this angle, I'm very interested in Norm Macdonald. I mean, I'm fascinated by him and his comedy and his burn bridges, but also, this might answer it, he stuck to exactly the way that he wanted to do comedy. And he sort of had a, disdain for people who did, he's fine with people who just told jokes, set up punchline, that's fine. But he didn't think of them as like breakthrough comedians. And on the other hand, he had a disdain for people who preached, but it was for something that just panned to the choir. And so he had a way of doing comedy, which was, I notice things, and when I think about them, they're really funny. And I can make them in this delivery that's just me talking to the audience in my jumbled way that I talk. And that's me being who I am in front of an audience. And the challenge is, can I actually make them laugh? Can I actually let them know how my jumbled thoughts go together enough that they understand the concept and laugh at it? He sort of had a, who was the Andy Kaufman vibe to him. So it's like there was a fourth wall there.
Professional style that he identified with. Can I be true to myself? That's good. But I think he seemed to be in his last phase wanting to get beyond that in terms of like wanting to do good to the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say, does your comedy help people?
Yeah, and that's the second thing I wanted to talk about is that, or just the second thing I wanted to mention to you. I was interested in his whole gambling thing because the things that he was trying to work out in his life, it's not totally clear that he resolved them. And so maybe like in his last few years, he was trying to really do good in the world. And that might be a perfect question. Your comedy seems so purposeful, and the thing that, at least to others, I mean, that's who you were. You were this comedian. And you were even sort of a sage on a stage to some people. Do you think you were using comedy as a vessel for your, values, doing good in the world? I'm not totally clear that his issues were resolved. You could talk about Norm Macdonald, this really funny guy that always made you laugh, or if you're really interested in his life, which I got interested in, it's a little gray. And so this isn't one of those stories where I say, oh, it's Norm Macdonald, here's a good case of natural recovery. But we can say, well, here's a guy who had the ingredients there, and you wonder how you might have worked with them.
Exactly. And we've talked about how you have clients, and one of the jobs is to encourage them to find and focus on their purpose.
Right.
And he's a person who seems to be yearning for purpose, and he has some of the elements for purpose. He's smart, and he is interacting with people, and he is getting them to think about things in new ways. So that, to me, is part of the elements of purpose. And then we talked about his son. I would never, there's a little stark. I had a brother who committed suicide. If I lost all my money and it disabled me for supporting my children and going to college, I'd kill myself. That, to me, you violated your basic contract in life. Now, I there were times when I didn't make a ton of dough, so you might say, well, should have gone out and worked more. But I could never give away and lose my money. By the way, I just wanted to give a shout out to Elliot Richter. When I was in high school, I grew up in a pretty, kind of a lower middle class, but achievement-oriented, mainly Jewish neighborhood. I had one friend named Elliot Richter who was a junior juvenile delinquent. But he wasn't dumb. And we played cards a couple of times. And, I lost all my money, which was like $5 or $10. And Elliot Richter said to me, I'll give you some advice, Stan. He called me Stan. If I were as smart and talented as you, I would never play cards, where you're just going to be some schmuck compared to,
right.
me. he was a better card player than me. And I took that lesson to heart. Why not, play the hand that you're dealt with, so to speak? If you're good at something, why go out of your way to be, do something you can't? I mean, there's better card players and worse card players. I mean, playing roulette and that kind of stuff's totally chance, but there's obviously good card players. And I know I read that Norm Macdonald he did that skill thing in Las Vegas or wherever they have a contest for poker players. And he did fairly well at one point. So I'm not I'm obviously, if anybody's been paying down, I'm not anti-alcohol. I'm not anti-drugs. But I'm really negative towards gambling.
What does gambling mean to you? Is that different than betting? If you go to a casino and bet, is that different than gambling?
I actually have it with Archie and a psychiatrist guy who went to Penn with us, and my bartender friend, who I quote at the beginning of my memoir, The Scientific Life on the Edge. We have a Super Bowl pool, and it's a little complex. We pick all of the playoff victories from the beginning all the way through, and it's $5 a point. You can win or lose 100 or so bucks, but obviously you have to know what's going on. You're picking actual victories. So gambling for me is like buying a lottery ticket or going to play roulette or playing some game of chance. I can never do that, and I don't have the skill level to have a meaningful impact on playing poker. And when you're playing in a house dealership, blackjack, you're not going to win.
So you're saying gambling for you is not something that, like, you could see yourself, well, you drink moderately. You could see yourself, you see reasons why you might take drugs, certain kinds of drugs, with benefit, but you can't see yourself gambling. But do you mean that for other people too, just across the board, universally, you're kind of down on gambling?
I don't believe any of my children gamble, whatever other activities, for better or worse, they've engaged in. I don't think they've gambled. And I believe gambling is the opposite of achievement. Achievement is when you take meaningful steps to produce positive outcomes. I'm very achievement oriented. And, I spend time with my grandkids, and, I'm Mr., there's a trend in American literature that people point out where, a young person sets out for a goal and works hard to accomplish it. Achievement imagery is built into American literature. And, I constantly ask my grandkids, did that have a positive impact? Are you trying to do something constructive? That's just the way I'm oriented. And I would never. Gambling is completely outside and anti those forces. So one of the questions I would ask him is, well, I don't know how old his son is. At some point, his son's going to be a teenager and a 20-year-old. We talked about all this, Skenazi's son's 23 now, and we're still I'm thinking of her as a 9-year-old, him as a 9-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, what values do you teach your son?
Mm-hmm.
Do you take him to Las Vegas and gambling? Or, do you try to teach him skills, whatever, the skills, whatever, humor, communication? What do you want for your son? Do you reward him when he sets out on a task and accomplishes it and does better at it, which is the opposite of gambling? One other key to what I might say to Norm Macdonald was he wanted to help blind people. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can make a donation to whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They're seeing eye dog things.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. Couldn't you? Right.
That money that if you want to make a contribution, if you wanted to help blind people, he makes it sound like, well, I'd like to interact with blind people so I can learn from them. Fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But, one way you could do that is you could spend time there. I happen to live in Morristown where they had a seeing eye dog, I don't know, farm or development place, and people would volunteer. They'd go there, and because you'd have to train the dogs, for people. And it costs money. Each dog, to buy it's X $1,000 for a dog to turn out to be a seeing eye dog.
So, and it opposes the idea of gambling because you have to have the money to be able to invest in this thing that's important to you and build on that. Yeah. I would like to make a distinction really quickly. And I know you had plenty that you wanted to talk about too.
Go on. I'm kind of explored most of the ideas I had run around.
There's well, just to come back to you have a negative reaction to gambling. I have a similar reaction, and I just want to make the distinction. We have a gambling track in our program, so we work with people who have problems in their lives related to gambling, and that's gone from they think they're getting carried away to people who have really. I mean, I've now worked with people who have really gone overboard. I mean, they got themselves in serious trouble, and
It's happened.
so you could. One of the ways someone explained their ideas of gambling to me before, I could totally understand when they explained what their life was like to me and their perception of life. Now, I wouldn't recommend continuing that mindset, but I could totally understand sort of a Carl Rogers cognitive empathy. Tell me about yourself and your
well, that's what Marc Maron
reasons.
did with Norm Macdonald. He said, well, what's going on in your life?
Right.
Right. Marc Maron didn't say, oh, gambling's so great.
Right.
He said, well, what's going on in your life? And Norm Macdonald sort of gave two different answers to that. One is, oh, I won some money once, and therefore that lured me in. But that doesn't make a ton of sense because he could make money.
Right.
But then he talked about the experience, and in a way it was kind of liberating to not have anything. In a way he viewed that as, well, I don't have to think about all my extraneous thoughts, and I can channel it's almost like he wanted to have to work hard. Maybe it's almost like he was too privileged.
Well, so there's something that goes back to what you said about gambling being the opposite of achievement. So someone explained to me before, they kind of felt like their life was nothing. They were not going to really make money, not going to have any progress in life. There's nothing to look forward to. It was bleak. So even though gambling to them, they could reason that, let's say buying a lottery ticket. I mean, what do you get, a 1 in 100 million chance? But at the same time, there's a part of him that felt like, well, 1 in 100 million is in some ways infinitely more than absolutely zero. So there's an instant where you're making a purchase and feel like you're doing something active that's getting you this chance to whatever the fantasy is to make all this money. Well, that's why I think you're right. That's the opposite of achievement, because
there's two elements to achievement. There's your internal motivation,
right,
and there's the environment you're in.
Right.
Gambling is a downwardly social mobile addiction. Well, most addictions run that way. And the way you described it is, if you're saying, it doesn't matter what I do, I'm not going to get out of this hole, that Appalachian or inner city Baltimore feeling, then gambling's as good as anything.
Right. Exactly. Why not gambling?
Some people and there's always that, so there's a big social component, but then on top of that, there's always, there's a certain number of people who somehow don't seem to fathom their own life. They have a lot of opportunities and skills, and yet they're not feeling it. And that's a little easier for us to work with, what, that's what I was trying to do with Norm Macdonald.
Right.
I'm saying, well, you have some skills. How do you want to use those skills to help blind people? How do you want to help use those skills or your gifts to help your audience expand their horizons? how do you want to use your gifts to communicate with the person who's most important to you in life, your son? He does have outlet, he does have skills, he does have options, he does have resources, he does have outlets. So, it's like in the life process program, we basically deal with mostly middle-class people. And, they come with some resources and assets. We're not in the homeless shelter. We're dealing with people who had successes in life, who have they paid a few bucks to talk to us. And so that's good. And that's actually a tool. When I talk to people, I always, I'm dealing with a woman now, and she's getting back into the workforce. She's in her late 40s. And I'm always identifying the skills that she's displaying, which are abundant. I always, very naturally say, well, you're a good writer. Or, she's filling out a lot of forms. And I say, I can't fill out forms. There are things I'd like to apply for, but I'm like a grant. I'm just not going to do it. And she says, well, they're tedious and I'm not going to miss out on these opportunities. And I say, well, I just want to point out, being attentive to details and being dedicated, that's good. So, I just want to identify that you're coming to the ball game, with, some balls and bats and stuff. So we're always encouraging people. We're always helping them to identify their own skill packet. And part of that is to get them on, help them to use that on track. And part of that is to be inspirational, because you were just saying, and we say this all the time, feeling hopeless and helpless, feeling that you can't manage your life, lacking agency, or feeling that the world is just is nowhere and you can't respond to it and help, and there's nothing in it for you, are two dimensions that are going to prevent you from doing anything. And doing anything is the reverse of being addicted.
Well done. Well, I'll let Norm Macdonald off the hook now, but I was just curious. It was a couple of weeks ago, and I was listening to that podcast after, of course, reading and dissected and just going down the rabbit hole of his comedy. And I was thinking, he mentioned going to a psychiatrist at one time, and the psychiatrist tried to be reflective, but I think he or she just said, well, you're gambling to avoid life. And he sort of said, yeah, I was hoping for it. So now what? And I was thinking, the way that Maron so seamlessly got him to start talking about things that you could tell maybe were bouncing around in his head, but never really said out loud. They're so basic. I really think that if he did something like
a better podcaster than Joe Rogan, is that your?
Oh, I don't know. They both have their strengths. I know we were down on Joe last week for just not being able to get his own stuff together, but at least he brought him to the territory where I imagined that if Norm did an LPP track and he signed up for it because he really wanted to do something, I'm actually confident that one of us, whoever he was with, being coached by, would have led him onto a positive track, maybe more so than the help he received elsewhere.
Somebody who knows that you can't tell people to do the right thing. I mean, there's sort of, psychiatry isn't giving people the right answers.
And that's right.
Helping isn't.
He at least knows that when he's interviewing people, it's not interesting to tell him what he thinks the right thing is. It's more interesting to ask them more about it. So Maron would relate to him. So Norm would talk about how he'd get depressing, kind of, well, then I go to this, I bought a house and now what do I do with it? So Maron would make a joke about, yeah, my house is so stupid. It's got this one empty room in it and I don't know what maybe there's termite dam. I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. Anyway, so your gambling was, you know what I mean? So it kind of lead him to this path.
I mean, it does make Norm Macdonald sound like a privileged guy who has more than he feels he deserves. And
that's exactly it. Yeah, exactly.
More than he knows what to do with.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I'd say, where does your son live? I mean, does he live in I assume he lives in a nice house. I guess he has an ex-wife in there. Maybe she makes a ton of dough on her own and they don't need his money, but that that's not usually how people think.
Mm.
Um, I mean, so I guess I would say, well, where do you live? Do you live in a house? And then I might, there's that old joke. I don't know. Maybe they didn't have this joke by the time you came around, but when you didn't finish your food, your mother would say, "Oh, people are starving in China."
Right, right.
And so, Norm Macdonald's throwing away hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know how political he is, but there are people who can't, don't have enough to eat, and they don't have anything.
There is a track in LPP where people are asked the question, how has your addiction made an impact on you financially, negative or positive? How much money are you spending? What could you have spent that money on? Imagine that you didn't have the problems that your addiction has been giving you and that you had the money, what would how much money could you save? How much could you have? That's a very simple exercise that we get a lot of feedback about, saying, that's so obvious, but never really put it all together that way. I could really.
Yeah, it's almost So I talk about money being one value, it's one of our, highlights. We have 10 exercises in each area, and managing your life and skills, managing money is pretty critical. And virtually all addictions are expensive. Gambling, I guess, is maybe the most, but virtually every, compulsive shopping and, drugs and alcohol cost money. And we feel in general tuning people into money is going to make them less inclined to do addictive things. Because money to buy all, drugs can be expensive. But then towards the end of the life process program, we deal with purpose. And Norm Macdonald seemed to have a little bit of trouble plugging in the money thing, but he himself was yearning for purpose. And, jumping from the money thing, are there any ways you feel you could use your money to be more helpful to people other than gambling, which is, a waste to be totally selfish, even when you're saying, well, I like to lose my money because in a way it makes me feel good. You're still, disregarding all the other uses ways that could be helpful in the universe.
There's something that my wife and I do. We donate to a charity called The Life You Can Save. It's Peter Singer promotes this charity a lot, and they've researched it for decades about exactly how many lives you are saving with what dollar amount, how is this working in, exactly what is your money going to? And it's a lot of I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Singer's shallow pond thought experiment. If you're walking down in your nice Nikes through the woods and there's a young child in a shallow pond, and there's no one around, and for some reason he's drowning, and you could easily pull him out, but it's going to mess up your nice Nikes. Would you do it? Everyone says, yeah. And his point, of course, is that regardless of the fact that you have to take care of people who are salient to you and in your purview, if you think about it, there are people in the world who are suffering, dying, who you could save with the amount of money that you would spend on those nice shoes that you probably don't need. So what's a way to turn your mind over to a kind of a charity that, is actually going to save lives, but you're using money maybe you wouldn't, you're just buying on extra stuff.
Double cappuccino.
So my wife and I do this thing where you give cash. Some people still use cash. I do. And if it's, let's say I planned on a coffee being $4, but it was only $3, we put that in a little jar, that $1 that I saved. And then at the end of the year, right around Christmas time for us, we'll make a donation to The Life You Can Save, which is like a nothing thing, but it turns our mind to thinking about financials and financial health and what we're using money for and how we're servicing the world and ourselves. And it's always been interesting.
We're talking about it. It's in keeping with that, is living a life of value. There's a guy I have dinner with, I don't know, once a year. He actually, he's a famous real estate guy. I mean, he's retired now. And we grew up in adjoining blocks in Philadelphia. And he once told me a story and said, "Oh, you'll think this is so funny." And they had two guests who were famous guys, and they told each of them that the other guy was hard of hearing. And so they each kept speaking louder and louder. And I said to my friend Art, "You don't know me." I'm for everything that I do is to encourage meaning. The last thing I want to do is to discourage two people from communicating.
Yeah.
If I go to a bar, I always ask some, it's dangerous. I actually, the last time I was at my local bar, I asked the guy who he voted for, and it seemed like that might have turned him off. You know what I mean? You're not really supposed to do that. We had been talking about, crime kind of things, and you and I had discussed Eric Adams, the New York mayoral Democratic candidate. So I said, "Oh, who did you?" And in New York, you vote in order. And so I said, "Who did you vote first for?" And he said, "I don't remember." So I figured, he didn't want to answer that. Well, you don't have to tell people who you voted for. But I'm always moving in the direction of trying to have meaningful interchanges, even when I'm not dealing with clients, and trying to get people to explore more ideas and to, expand their thought horizons, which to some extent Norm Macdonald said seems like he was doing professionally. So I get where I'm going was, in a way, you can ask every action you do, you can say, is this a valuable action? Is this something that doesn't screw up the earth, but also in some way, makes a positive contribution? You can help people in the street, you can thank people. You can go in the other direction and get in a little bit of trouble, telling people to shut off their engines. It's against the law to run your engine. Idle your car in New York City and maybe a lot of places. So, we're taught, in a way, we're asking Norm Macdonald, are you living a life of value? Or you say you want, have higher aspirations, you're concerned about, religious values, or is your life a life of value and making a positive input in your daily life and into larger goals? That's, in a way, that's what we try to do, really, kind of everybody.
Well, obviously, condolences to his family, and that's sad to hear of his passing. I was heartbroken when I heard that he had died. So, just to make clear to everybody, it's a thought experiment worth running, because it was just such an ambiguous kind of problem solving on his end. It's not quite easy to tell if he's solved some of his problems or got into that better life channel or not. I hope that he did.
And you also had that podcast where, in a way, Marc Maron, is that his name?
Maron, yeah.
Is kind of, he did a mini version of what we try to do. You pointed it out. It was, one of the better examples of motivational value interview, purposeful interviewing that you've seen on the media. So shout out to him as well. Now,
did you have, before we go, you had something that you wanted to bring up and discuss?
Another area to go into, but it's a large area. Maybe we should do it another time. I'll just preview it by saying it's disease envy. It's centered around somebody, a woman who wrote an article saying how glad she was to finally get a diagnosis to go along with her diagnoses, I think, of depression and anxiety, to get a diagnosis of ADHD, which she felt had been reserved kind of almost unfairly for men, and how glad she was to have this third diagnosis added onto her profile. And I was going to take that in a lot of different directions. There's a racial and social component to ADHD diagnoses. She's the medication she's taking stunt her emotional responses. So, that's a big topic and a challenging one. Maybe we can do it at some future date.
Okay, how about people tune in? We'll do it next week, and
All right.
a week will pass and things will happen. But let's start with that next week.
I hope so. All right, Zach. Very interesting. Good talking with you then.
Pleasure as always.